Welcome to How the World Works, where we talk about jobs and jobs we've had and jobs we didn't have, and the meaning of jobs in our lives and in the economy and in our society, other than just being a paycheck. I have a guest today I've been very much looking forward to. This is my old friend Marian Tupy. Marian is with the Cato Institute and is the editor of humanprogress.org, where they bring you good news about what's going on in human civilization. And interesting background. Tell us a little bit about where you came up in your education and your early days.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to see you. Well, I was born in communist Czechoslovakia behind the Iron Curtain. Back then, it was called the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. Uh, Socialism is gone. So is the country. We separated into Czech Republic and Slovakia. And then, when I was a teenager, after the wall fell, my parents, well, and the children, we emigrated to South Africa. And then I guess I went to high school and college in South Africa, and then I went to do my postgraduate studies in Britain at St Andrews University, and eventually I ended up at the Cato Institute, where I started in 2002, and
An old hand by now.
old hand by now. And in about 2000, when I first started at Cato, I was mostly working on the transition of communist economies to capitalist economies, and also on economic development in sub-Saharan Africa. And then about 12 or 13 years ago, I started this website, humanprogress.org, which is basically a website that just tells people, or rather informs the public about all the ways in which the world is much better than it used to be, with the view that if people don't believe that the world is improving, if they don't believe that life in America today is better than what it used to be, then what's the point of keeping free markets and liberal democracy, right? I mean, if you're an 18-year-old and you just keep hearing that America is hell on earth, why would you support the economic and political institutions that make America work? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
You must. Well, I know you do share this view. But one of the things that just makes me, I would pull my hair out if I had any hair to pull out, is when people talk about sort of mid to late 1950s as the great golden age of the American economy.
Hmm.
The Eisenhower years. And there were a lot of good things going on in the post war
Yeah.
years. The 1950s were certainly better than the 1940s, and the 1940s were a bit better than the 1930s, and so on and so forth. But if you tried to foist a 1957 standard of living on a 2025 American, you would have a fight on your hands. People don't really understand the ways in which the material conditions of how people live, not only in the poor countries, which have changed radically in the last 30 years, really, but in the rich countries as well. That if you can go back to the 1970s, which I'm old enough to remember, the standard of living for kind of middle class to upper middle class professionals would look really quite poor by what our current expectations are. Could you maybe speak a little about your observations about that?
Sure. Well, I think that American standards of living in 1950s are probably comparable to what they were in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s.
Right. Yeah.
But let's start with the nature of jobs. So this is America before really the takeoff of the service industry. So you're talking mostly about jobs. Some of them still in agriculture,
Hmm.
but most of them in manufacturing sector. They are much more dangerous. They are much more difficult on your body, and so moving away from those very physically demanding jobs into the service economy is, of course, a step in the right direction. But also in terms of the sort of things that people could afford. I mean, if you look at 1950s houses, for example, they are much smaller. They have very fewer amenities. 1950s is the decade when air conditioning takes off. Thank God for that in the United States. But still, it is much more expensive than.
Except the fact that it ruined American government by
Yes.
making Washington D.C. habitable
That's
year
right.
round.
That's right. That's right. But
There
at
are
least
externalities.
yeah, you don't have to sleep on the iron stairs in New York in summer as people used to. You know what are they called? Those iron
Fire escapes.
fire escapes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I lived in India with no air conditioning,
Yeah.
so
So you
yeah,
know how,
yeah.
how dreadful it is. So houses were much smaller. Um, Food was much worse in a
Yeah.
sense that Americans didn't prioritize back then, veggies. And there's one thing that I love, and that is in that great American show called Mad Men,
Hmm.
where Don Draper and his sidekick they go to California on a jet. This is in the 1960s, and it's a big deal in the office, right? These are rich, accomplished people, but they are actually going to take a flight from New York to California, and on the way back, they are bringing with them oranges.
Yes.
Because of course, oranges are okay. You can get them in California, but in New York, it's too far.
It's funny you mentioned America in the 50s and 60s versus the old Iron Curtain. So many years ago, not long after the wall fell, we met some people who had grown up in East Germany, and they said that they knew that things had changed when oranges suddenly appeared in the grocery stores.
Yes.
Because before, under communism, if you could ever buy oranges, you could only buy them essentially the week of Christmas.
That's absolutely correct. I'm speaking from personal experience. There were oranges and mandarins and bananas once a year at Christmas. The oranges came from Cuba. So in exchange for subsidies from the Eastern Bloc to a failing dictatorship on the island of Cuba, we would get oranges once a year from them. But we so one I think that one falsehood that people have is that communism. You see, the problem with communism was not that we were somehow going back in time or that we didn't have many of the things that you had. The problem is that everything we had was 20 or 30 or 40 years behind, and it was much worse quality.
Yeah.
So it's not like communism was just a massive decrease in standard of living. It was just a stagnation, or if there was growth, it was just absolutely tiny. So we did have cars. They just happened to be crappy Trabants, and it was the same kind of car for 20 or 30 years. The notion of a car changing every year, like in the United States, a new model, that was unknown. At the time when Americans were already had color TVs, in our population, we were just maxing out on black and white TVs, At the time when you were switching to CDs, it was very much still a cassette type of world. One last thing on the 1950s. So not only was the food worse, the shops were smaller. Sorry, the houses were smaller, and the jobs were much more dangerous and much more exacting. But of course, it wasn't a particularly good time for women, for gays, for black people, and so forth. So on many levels, the United States is much better off than it used to be. And these ideas about the world was much better, a few decades ago or a few centuries ago, it's all nonsense.
Yeah, it's poisonous though, and this nostalgia though I think is really hard to kind of beat out of people. And you can tell them about it. I've written endlessly about it. I'll advise people to go back and one of the things I like to tell people to do is go back and read old fiction with a sort of economic eye to it, and pick up what you can about people's standards of living from fiction. And I remember the Stephen King novel *The Stand*, which I think came out in maybe 1979 or 77. There's a whole little plot line about a woman saving up to buy 2 pounds of butter because her son's coming home to visit and she wants to cook for him. And there's just no one in 2025 is worried about the price of 2 pounds of butter. I mean, we're all talking about the price of eggs right now as though it's the apocalypse. And granted, it's a real hardship for people who are very low income and spend a disproportionate share of their income on groceries. But it's a whole different world and a whole different kind of economic context for that. I remember, so my mother would have grown up in the 1940s, mainly in the 1950s. I think she graduated high school in the middle 50s. And I came home from college one time, and I was going to make dinner for her. And being a young college student, I was being sort of a snoot, and I decided I was going to make spinach crepes. And I used to kind of cook. And so I go to the store, and I bought some spinach, and I'm taking it home, and I'm chopping it up. And my mother looks at it, and she says, "What's that?" And I said, "It's spinach." And I could see this little light go off in her head, because for her, spinach came in a can.
Right.
And that was the only spinach she'd ever thought about in her life. Now, she'd probably had fresh spinach in the grocery store by that point for 20 years or 15 years or something. But she was so ingrained in these, sort of 1940s, 1950s, small town way of thinking that she just had probably walked past it and never really registered in her head that this, thing that looked kind of like lettuce is the same thing that comes in the can. Her parents lived in a company town called Phillips, Texas, which was set up by Phillips Petroleum. And it was, in a sense, the kind of, I think, the ideal sort of welfare state that your sort of Elizabeth Warren types and certain progressives and certain people on the right look at in this sort of form of you know, corporate patronage, of corporate paternalism, where you didn't actually, I guess you owned your house, but not the land your house was on. And there were no taxes for the schools. The company just paid for the schools, and things were kind of done. So you had a lot of things taken care of for you, but no real power over your own life. And then, of course, when Phillips eventually decided that he needed to shut that plant down because it wasn't economic anymore, the town just disappears. There was no town to disincorporate or anything like that. So there were some people who hauled their houses away on flatbed trucks, and it just became, overnight this empty, vacant sort of place. And it's strange to me that people on the left who traditionally have had a skeptical view of corporate power also want the corporation to be essentially in loco parentis for people who or people of more modest means to provide for them, health care, pensions, retirement planning, increasingly education, things like that. And it's I can see the allure of it from a politician's point of view, because if you make a business pay for stuff, you don't have to put it on your budget as a politician and tax people for it and account for it. It doesn't show up on your numbers as an outlay. But it's strange to me that people who will talk in these scathing terms about capital B, big business, and billionaires and oligarchs as I love the way Bernie Sanders says that, because it always sounds like he's talking about Islam at the beginning. He says oligarchs, and he's got this funny way of saying that word, oligarchs. That they would expect them to be playing this central role in people's lives, and they don't seem to have the kind of moral or economic or political imagination to see the many ways in which that could go wrong.
Part of the problem I have with this conversation, or rather with what they are trying to accomplish, is that in their view, the United States is still at the time of the robber barons, much misnamed, whereby the workers are completely rightless, where the workers don't have any agency, where they are being exploited left and right. I mean, the image that we are being painted is though, there is this zero-sum game between the workers on the one hand and corporations on the other hand, ignoring the fact that many of these workers have 401ks that depend on the corporations to actually do very well. But the bottom line is that I think that so the left has an incentive in creating an image of the working class as being basically being victims. And one thing that Donald Trump understood is that it's not just people on the left who want to feel like victims, but also people on the right who want to feel like victims. And so instead of having a country where half of the population feels like victims and the other one is all about the sunny uplands of future and so forth, you now have two parties that basically appeal to the sense of victimhood. It's a very strong emotion. And are outdoing each other in terms of how bad things in America are. So we'll see how quickly Trump can pivot from saying that everything in America was crap to everything is absolutely brilliant, excellent, it's never been better.
Yeah.
But the reality is that compared to America's past and compared to the rest of the world, we have an incredibly abundant country. You talked about eggs. Let me just give you one example. People constantly underestimate how little money people made in the past and how expensive things were in the past. Over the century between 1919 and 2019, the price of eggs has collapsed so far that for the same amount of money that in 1919 would get you one egg, in 2019 you can get 36 eggs. Okay, so these basic things just became so much less expensive.
Yeah.
The same amount of money same amount of time that would have bought you one chicken in 1919 would have bought you 26 chickens in 2019. So you have these short-term fluctuations in the price, but the long-term trend in America is toward greater and greater abundance.
Yeah. You must get a lot of pushback from human progress because people don't want to hear this. People want to be told that things are terrible, they've never been worse, that you should feel bad about stuff. And there's a weird little psychology there that maybe we can revisit. But I want to stay in your youth actually for a minute because one of the things about communism and one of the things about apartheid in South Africa that both seem to me to be particularly dehumanizing is the ways in which people were circumscribed in their personal economic ambition, about what kind of work you could do, what kind of investments you could make, whether you could start a business, that sort of thing. And we talk about, civil rights. We talk about, questions of being able to vote and all these things that are very important. But we often, I think, give short shrift to this very, very important aspect of human life, which is the ability to make your own decisions about how you earn a living, provide for yourself, and provide for your family. And I wonder what your experiences were with those things as an
Well,
observer, anyway.
well, let's start with a simple example, which is South Africa is actually in some ways simpler because South Africa did have an advanced capitalist economy, um, primarily for white people, although also for Indians and coloreds. In South Africa, colored doesn't mean what it means in the United States. It's a normally acceptable term, which means mixed race people. Who participated in actually a normal dog eat dog, capitalist creative destruction, etc. Black people were, in many ways, prevented from that kind of system because of what in South Africa was called the color bar. Now, the color bar was basically created so that black people couldn't compete with white people, especially back then when it first started in mining, and later, of course, in manufacturing. Corporations, contrary to what a lot of people might think, were always great opponents of apartheid because they understood that it hit their profit line. They could have hired millions of black people in the mines originally, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and then later in the manufacturing sector, but they were prevented from doing that. So they were paying much more for a worker because they had to be white only, right? So there was that mismatch. It was, broadly speaking, a capitalist economy, but one part of the population was prevented from participating in it, leading to all sorts of negative consequences, including black people being unable to create wealth, intergenerational wealth, and so forth. The situation was slightly different, well, perhaps greatly different in Czechoslovakia in a sense that because there wasn't a market in anything except for the black market, all those things that you associate with economic and financial decision didn't exist there. You didn't really have an opportunity to invest in the stock market. You didn't have an opportunity to invest in mutual funds or in 401ks. You didn't have an investment. You didn't have an opportunity to do basic capitalist things. You were given a job by the government, and in return for the job, you were given a stipend, essentially, which was completely unrelated to market reality. The multiplier difference between a street sweeper and a medical doctor was maybe 1 to 2. Okay, so back in the 1980s, maybe a doctor would make 3,000 crowns. I'm talking now about our currency back then, and a street sweeper would make maybe 1,500 to 2,000 crowns. So there was also no incentive system to create additional human capital, except, oddly enough, in a communist society, for the sake of status.
Yeah.
You couldn't.
I assume the result of this was not that the streets were swept with the precision and expertise we would expect from medical care.
That and medical care wasn't all that. It was, people have this. Even to today, people like Bernie Sanders keep saying, Cuba may be a hellhole, but at least they have good healthcare and that sort of thing. That's, of course, complete nonsense. Our healthcare, once again, was decades behind that in the United States. And what was more important is that here in the United States, people complain because much of our healthcare, or some of it at least, is depends on how much money you have. But in communist Czechoslovakia, healthcare depended on who you could bribe. I mean, a doctor wouldn't look at you in a hospital unless you provided a bribe at the beginning of your stay in a hospital, or alternatively, unless you were connected to somebody who could be useful to you in the future. So if you are a medical doctor, and I know I've seen this, both of my parents are medical doctors, basically a patient comes in and the first question you ask, who is this person? Who are they connected to? And if they are connected to the local head of the distribution of meat or vegetables, or alternatively they are connected to the local head of the Communist Party, then they will get a fantastic service. But if you are just a wife of a plumber, for example, you get very little.
Yeah. Did you work as a teenager? Did you have jobs and stuff while you were in school, or was that?
Yes. So jobs for young people, that was unheard of in Czechoslovakia, because over time people sort of developed contempt for work.
Hmm.
Oddly enough, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, and that was really true. I mean, doing work was, i you were a bit stupid if you really worked, right? That was the essence of how people approached work. But once we arrived in South Africa, we didn't have much money, but it was still a step up from communist Czechoslovakia. Being a middle class person in South Africa was still a step up, but we didn't have much money. So the first thing I started doing at the age of 16 was I started working in a photo shop. So I was developing films, and I was yeah, basically taking money, doing administration. So that was my first job. And then later in South Africa, to save money for my postgraduate studies in Britain, I was working at night for a private security company. Because even back then, in the late 1990s, things already started sort of breaking down when it came to personal security. So we had
Were you a night watchman or a
no, no, no.
bodyguard?
I wasn't. No, no. I was. No, not me. No, I was in a call center. So
Okay.
if an alarm went off in a certain suburb, that was covered by the security firm, then I would have to call them and say, "Hey, are you okay? Or do you need assistance?" That sort of thing.
Call centers are tough places to work. I think the worst job I ever had in my life by far. I wasn't even doing telemarketing. I was just doing consumer research, but working in one of these places. And I had this survey I had to get people to try to finish, and it was for. I know I've told the story before on this podcast, so I'll try to keep it short. But it was for Alfa Romeo,
Hmm.
a car
Beautiful
company.
cars. Yeah.
Yeah, but they hadn't sold cars in the United States in 25 years at that point. I think this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And they were thinking about re-entering the U.S. market, so they were doing this, consumer research. And the survey was set up to sort of try to mask the fact that it was Alfa Romeo asking, "I'm going to ask you about a random car brand," and I see I'm supposed to ask about pregnant pause. Oh, Alfa Romeo, and but it took just forever. It was like an hour to do the survey or something. So the only people who would talk to you were car nuts or shut-ins or crazy people, and I'm not sure they got really very much use out of it. But yeah, they are lovely cars, and I'm glad they finally got back into the U.S. market. I like their stuff here. So the call center, and then was that your last job before you came to the United States?
No, not at all. Then once I went to university at St Andrews, once again, limited money, so I worked as a waiter. Obviously, American customers were always much desired because they actually left tips,
Tips, right? Yeah.
which nobody else in Europe used to do. And then my final job was actually a petrol gas, gas attendant. I wouldn't actually put gas into people's cars, but I would be the one taking the money and selling cigarettes and things like that.
Worked at a gas station.
Yeah. So these sorts of very basic jobs. I think back then minimum wage in Britain, which is what I was paid, it was Shell, was £4.50 and that sort of thing, and a pint of beer was probably £4.50. So
So a good ratio then, yeah.
well, that's yeah.
Yeah, I worked in a 7-Eleven, similar kind of job. I've never made minimum wage.
Hmm.
I've worked like all sorts of very modest jobs. I worked at Burger King, I worked at 7-Eleven, I was a furniture mover and that kind of stuff. But I was never paid minimum wage my whole life. I was always paid at least a little bit more than that. And in fact, the first article I ever wrote for National Review was a Labor Day piece about that curious fact that a misunderstood fact, and you talked about this portrayal of American workers as being sort of helpless and feckless, is not really the case at all. That employers, particularly at these sort of more modest kinds of jobs, are desperate for people who are kind of reliable and who can be counted on. And I tell people that McDonald's may not start you at a very high wage, but if you're there 6 months and have shown that you can be relied on, show up for work, all that kind of stuff, you'd be shocked how fast they will up the pay scale for people they want to keep or put them into management or do other things with them. And when they find an employee who's actually worth keeping around, they will do a considerable amount.
They will bump you up, yeah. Well, of course, in my case, the minimum wage job that couldn't have happened because it only lasted for 6 months while I was a student and that sort of thing. So there was no option of going up.
Were you working late nights in the gas station?
No, absolutely, yeah.
What were your hours? Where'd you work?
Gosh,
I did 11 to 7 in the morning, so I was the overnight shift.
Yeah, it wasn't that bad. It was probably from 6 or 7 p.m. to maybe 2 or 3 a.m. But you know, I'm sure you'll be able to relate. It's one thing to work in a place where people don't know you, but as a student
Right.
working at a gas station, and you have all the students coming from parties, they were just having a lot of fun,
Of course, yeah.
and you are there selling them, whatever energy drinks and cigarettes. So you have to have a personality where you just don't take this serious. Now they were people. Oddly enough, the only person who really made fun of me for working at a station, at a gas station, was a professor, a communist professor from Chile, which is just perfect. He escaped Chile because he couldn't stand Pinochet and that sort of thing. So he ends up at an American university, sorry, at a British university. Call me to his toenails, but he just hated the idea that people would have menial jobs like that.
Yes, the Champagne radicals.
Yeah.
Yeah, the people who come to 7-Elevens at 3:30 in the morning in Lubbock, Texas, tend to be not sober. And on the Burger King I worked at was across the street from this gigantic cowboy dance club, and so also a pretty rowdy crowd at 2:15 when they turned them all out of the bar, because the people who were going to Burger King were. The night hadn't gone the way they wanted it to.
Right.
They didn't want to end up at Burger King that night. They wanted to end up in maybe different circumstances and different activities. And not always happy to be there, but often
Yeah.
not too
Yeah.
bad either.
Yeah.
So, human progress, work. How are these things related to one another? There's the great Hayekian line about free markets being a discovery process by the way in which we figure out how to serve one another and meet one another's needs. I think people misunderstand that about work a lot. They think that the point of work is to give you a paycheck so that you can live your life. But the point of a job is whatever the job is there to do. The point of the jobs at General Motors are not to create this General Motors welfare state for people. It's to produce cars. Jobs create value for people. And there's this, ongoing problem they call in economics the make work fallacy. The idea that we can make things economically better just by creating jobs and paychecks for people, irrespective of whether those things create value. There's this among the many economic myths I hate. One is hearing about how good things were in the post-war era compared to now. The other is this myth that Henry Ford magicked the car market into existence by paying his workers enough to buy a car, which is not what happened. As you probably know, Henry Ford did pay unusually high wages because he found it really hard to hold on to employees, because the sort of mechanized and routinized version of production that he was famous for kind of popularizing and inventing, this assembly line work, was so boring and so deadening and so soul-killing that people just hated to do it, even though it paid pretty well. And so he had to really keep raising wages to
So
to
huge
keep
turnover, and if suddenly a person doesn't come, on the belt,
Yeah, you've got a huge problem.
then everything stops.
Yeah. So what can we do to help people understand what the point of work actually is, which is to create things and services that are actually valuable to people rather than just to get a paycheck? How should we change our conversation, maybe our policy conversation, our political debate about jobs? Because every time I hear someone who's running for president or for running for re-election and say, and 16 million jobs were created by me on my watch, and even if we get past the by me thing, I always want to say, well, jobs doing what?
Yeah.
What kind of jobs? Because were they 16 million new EPA regulators, or were they 16 million oil and gas jobs?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I never thought of this particular question. I wonder to what extent Americans don't really. You seem to imply that Americans don't understand that. But are we
Yes,
sure?
I do mean to imply that.
Yeah. I haven't noticed that people simply do not understand that they have to perform in order to be paid, that they have to deliver a certain product or a certain service. Now, maybe in DC, yeah.
I think people understand that about their own lives.
Yeah.
I don't think they understand it from an economic point of view. I think that people really do believe that if we paid every unemployed person to dig holes and then fill them up and dig holes and fill them up, that somehow the economy would be more productive and robust because these people would be getting paychecks. They'd be spending those paychecks on things. So when you talk about reducing the size of the government payroll or reducing welfare benefits of various things, you often get these arguments about, well, that's going to hurt consumption. And we talk a lot about consumption in this idiotic thing of, well, consumption is 81% of the economy.
Yeah.
Well, production is 100% of the economy of the useful part of the economy. We have a real tendency to look at it from only one point of view, I think.
Yeah, no. I get your point about that. I don't know what to do besides. Okay, so there is this misconception, presumably produced by decades of wrong way of talking about it, and part of the job of what I do at Human Progress, and part of the job what you do on this podcast, is to remind people where wealth really comes from. That we are engaged in a creative destruction type of economy, and that if certain ways of doing things are substandard or not needed, they need to be replaced by something else. To remind people that just because there are tens of thousands of people who are engaged in the production of candles doesn't mean that we should keep that going if we can get light bulbs, or if tens of thousands of people are engaged in the production of typewriters, that we shouldn't keep that going because now everybody has a laptop or whatever else. Now, I will grant you this: is that there is, both on the left and the right, a technophobic and change-phobic viewpoint. On the right, this is people who. I heard Tucker Carlson very famously was interviewed by Ben Shapiro, and Ben Shapiro asked him whether Tucker would cancel or abolish autonomous trucks, autonomous vehicles. And Tucker would say it in a second, which means that he would much rather have those truckers drive 12 hours a day, and increasing the price of the commodity that they are transporting, rather than having autonomous trucks do the work, and presumably keep those truckers doing that work forever, even though there are better and easier opportunities. Once again, thinking that those truckers, because they are truckers, they cannot do anything else. New York Times had a very interesting interview with Steve Bannon, whose point is exactly that. He is a technophobe. He doesn't want America to adopt new technologies because they may be disruptive to the way that Americans have become accustomed to lead their lives. Now, aside from that being economically stupid, the problem is that the rest of the world is not going to be indulging us in this kind of fantasy. I mean, the Chinese presumably don't care how we feel about technology. They are going to march ahead with their economic and technological development. And I would much rather the United States remain the top dog in a world where the only alternative is a communist dictatorship.
Yeah. You mentioned Tucker and Steve Bannon. One thing I find in common with these guys who are these self-appointed tribunes of the working classes, Tucker's a Swiss boarding school guy who works for a foreign-owned multinational media conglomerate. Steve Bannon's a former Goldman Sachs guy. I don't think they actually know much about this world that they propose to defend and to fortify. We talk about even in Texas, where I'm from, there's this sort of nostalgia for kind of rural and agricultural life.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the few things that I think actually is an actual, like, sort of ironclad law of economics. I think most laws of economics, so-called, are pretty flexible. But I think one of the few that actually seems to be true in almost every society and almost every culture is if you have a large group of people who are engaged in subsistence agriculture, and you give them the choice to do literally anything else, they will choose literally anything else. They will do almost anything else. If you look at the Great Migration in the United States of African Americans going to take these factory jobs that, as you point out, were not great paying, were often dangerous. It beat the heck out of being a farm worker in a sort of low-performing, low-capital version of agriculture. And there's this sense of wanting that kind of. I think they have a false idea about community and about what communities were actually like at that point. and what they are like now. We've got a lot of places in the country that are economically struggling because they are towns and small cities and sometimes regions that have outlived their economic reason for being. We've seen this, happen in various places, various times. And often, if you've got a healthy economy, these things get recycled and reused. We were talking earlier before the podcast started that I lived in New York City for a while, and when I first moved to New York, I lived in the South Bronx, and it was this kind of early stage gentrification in the South Bronx, and people were building these loft apartments and stuff, and the buildings there had all really been piano factories at one point. Apparently, the South Bronx was like the Detroit of pianos at one point. There were dozens and dozens of piano manufacturers. There aren't any piano manufacturers there anymore. I think Steinway still manufactures on Long Island or something like that, but there aren't really any in the South Bronx anymore. Now, when the piano industry left, other things came in. New York City, in spite of all of its problems, is a pretty economically functional place. We talk about Detroit and the situation with the automotive industry there. A lot of people don't know the early history of that. That Detroit ended up becoming a successful center of automotive manufacturing because it had been a center of manufacturing marine engines for boats and commercial ships. And so they had a lot of people around who were engineers and designers and workers who had experience building motors and putting things together. In the late 19th, early 20th century, there were something like 115 car companies started in the United States, and they were mostly started in Ohio and New England. And the ones in Michigan were kind of outliers, but the ones in Michigan ended up being the ones that were successful because of the history of building other sorts of engines and motors and vehicles there, and they had a kind of workforce they wanted. So we go through these cycles where places have an economic reason for being, and then that goes away for whatever reason. They're the biggest manufacturer of buggy whips before the car is invented, to use the great economic cliche, or typewriters before the word processor. Now, there are two things you can do about this. You can either try to give these places incentives to move on economically and develop and repurpose their capital, including their human capital. You can also, have people disperse. I mean, Muleshoe, Texas hasn't always been there, and maybe it won't always be there. There are cities that come and go and towns that come and go, and that's okay. There's no reason these places have to be there forever and ever. Or you can do what we try to do, which is to maintain these communities in some sort of sense of semi-dependency indefinitely. So we'll have some kind of public works project. Mm-hmm. We'll have, government try to do this, that, or the other, create some artificial industry, create some industrial incentives to try to get companies to move these places. These programs don't have a very good record, for one thing, almost always, because it's hard to get the political commitment out of even the national government to create economic incentives that are as powerful as what the markets are going to tell you about where you should be investing your capital and where your business should be. But also they end up almost always coming 20 years too late, when the workforce has already started to dissipate and your capital has already gone on to other new uses. So you mentioned the Schumpeterian term creative destruction earlier. And there's a certain, and it's not a small minority, maybe a majority of people who are really, really uncomfortable with it.
Yes.
With the flux of life in a modern capitalist dynamic economy. And there's a class aspect to this, I think, that where, people like you who are educated and internationally mobile and have certain kinds of skills that you can apply in different sorts of settings. For people like that, the world looks like one big ball of opportunities. I can do this thing, I can do that thing. You're unusual in that you've had the same job at the same place, or a job at the same institution for a long time, for more than 20 years, whereas most people in your kind of class, in your kind of background, and your sort of educational attainment tend to change employers more frequently. So for some people, that world looks like opportunity and excitement and chances to do things. For other people, it looks like a big ball of anxiety and challenges and insecurity. And it's the same world with the same opportunities. And but the people are different, and their ability to access and make the most of those are different. So how do we deal with that socially and politically?
Well, I wish I knew. Look, let me first acknowledge, yes, a lot of people are uncomfortable with change. And what's more important is that to a lot of people, change seems to be accelerating. In fact, one of the arguments that Jordan Peterson has, that when he criticizes, I mean, he's a pro-free market guy, but when he criticizes capitalism, when he wants to criticize capitalism, it's that change is getting out of hand. It is becoming too fast. So how do you do it? I think that there are certain emotions, certain ways of people seeing the world that you cannot help. They are deeply ingrained in the human psyche. What I'm trying to do is to explain to them the logical consequences of their beliefs. So let's say that you are living in a society of, I don't know, cave dwellers, and you are accustomed to it. It's the best that you know, and suddenly somebody comes out and says, let's get out of the caves and let's build a bunch of huts on a hill. That's a change. Do you say no? We would rather stay, because if you do, if you decide that you've had enough technological change, then where is that cutoff?
Yeah.
Is the cutoff in 1900? Is the cutoff in 1924, 4 years when Calvin Coolidge's son died from an infected blister because they didn't have antibiotics, and antibiotics comes out in 1928? When do you make that cutoff, given that there are still a lot of things that are wrong with the world, and there always will be? But what we can say with rational optimism is that 10 years from now, many of the maladies which affect people health-wise and so forth will be resolved through basic march of technological progress. Do we simply say, no, this is enough? And what about, and this is perhaps most important, what about of all the challenges we don't know anything about, the unknown unknowns that are going to be facing humanity and the world? An asteroid, a pathogen, some fundamental change in the world, that in the way that the planet operates. At that point, you want to be the most wealthy and the most technologically sophisticated society you can possibly be in order to have a fighting chance of addressing that problem. Yeah. COVID is a perfect example.
Do you really think that the pace of change is accelerating? Because I hear this all the time, and I've actually kind of got my doubts about it. So if you look at the early part of the Industrial Revolution, you've got a relatively short period of time in which you go from a world in which basically everyone works in agriculture to a world in which basically no one works in agriculture. It takes a very short period of time.
Yeah.
I think the 1990s, my youth, the social difference between a world in which the internet is known to a few nerds in a few labs in a few places, and a world in which the internet is everywhere in everyone's pocket, is a huge radical social change that I don't really think has probably been replicated since then. Even with smartphones changing the way that people interact with the internet and it being kind of truly ubiquitous and not just on your laptop and your desktop, that was a huge technological change as well. But I'm not sure that anything has happened that is as socially significant as that since then. There's a lot of panic talk about AI right now, and partly that is the technophobia you mentioned. Partly I think it's another iteration of that misunderstanding of jobs. You hear a lot of talk about, there aren't going to be any jobs, as though human action and human ingenuity is just going to suddenly be worthless.
Yeah.
So am I wrong about that? Am I wrong to think that technological change and social change associated with it is lumpy? It's not linear, and this idea that it's accelerating in a kind of regular sort of way, I think, is doesn't seem to comport with my experience.
Right. So of course, until recently, the argument was that there isn't enough technological change. Peter Thiel's great criticism of Silicon Valley and of the last, say, 30 years is that, not enough has changed. We've made a lot of progress in the world of bits. We haven't made enough progress in the world of atoms. Tyler Cowen has written a book about the Great Stagnation. So until recently, the argument was the exact opposite. Now the critics of capitalism are saying that, it's incredibly fast. I would probably say that people feel this change much more because of the social media and the immediacy and intimacy of information. If there's a crazy new invention in China, like that humanoid robot that they produced a couple of weeks ago, not humanoid, but fantastically agile robot, everybody will immediately see it around the world, 4 billion, 6 billion, 8 billion people, and but what they don't realize is that it's going to take decades before those things are actually going to become relevant to their own personal lives and to the economy. So it's probably the speed of the information spread that is much more discombobulating than the actual change in technology. And those things are going to take much longer time to permeate into society. And of course, as you said, at the end of the day, there is going to be a lot of work still remaining for people. Not only is there the concept of fixed work fallacy, for fixed number of work fallacy, but there is also the issue of specific or artisanal work that the machines cannot do. For example, most of us are satisfied in going to a shop and buying shoes that cost, fancy black shoes for work will cost you $250 and that sort of things. But those are mostly produced by machines with a little bit of human oversight. But humans still make shoes.
Mm-hmm.
You can go to Italy and get a beautiful pair of shoes. They just cost $5,000, and that's not going to disappear. You are still going to have shoes made for the market and clothes made for the mass market cheaply, perhaps even freely eventually. But there will always be people who will be making those particular one-of-a-kind things that people might want to buy. And in that sense, I'm not worried that nobody will have work. And in any case, we already have a population of humans who don't do any work and seem to have a very good time doing so, and that's the retirees.
Yes.
They don't, they seem to be quite happy traveling around the world, and a lot of them and enjoying friendships and going to dinners and doing sports. And when they get sick and when they are near the end, you don't see them all begging to be put out of their misery. Everybody hangs on their lives as long as they can. So it seems to me that that there is a little bit too much gloom about the future.
Yeah, I've for years I had written about the sort of inherent value of human effort and human labor and human ingenuity. And I remember I went back and looked at an old essay of mine in which I had a line that said something approximately, "There is no limit to the number of things that I would be willing to pay people to do for me if I had the resources to do that." There just isn't. There are like two things I like to do. I like to work and I like to entertain myself. And all the other stuff I don't want to do. If I can pay someone to do it, I will do it. And but now having 4 children in diapers, I have a much more intense appreciation of the fact that human effort that you can pay people to do is really, really, really super, super valuable and super, super useful. And but some of those jobs are difficult and unpleasant, and people aren't going to want to do them forever.
Correct.
And I have some hope for the kind of AI and robotics and stuff of them being able to take over some of those things. You mentioned care for elderly people can be a very, very, very difficult thing. And while they also need human companionship and human attention, a certain level of automated care for things like cooking and trash disposal and transportation,
Washing.
yeah,
Elderly people cannot help themselves. It's
yeah. But
incredibly complicated. And
I'm sort of on an aesthetic level full of dread about self-driving cars because I really like to drive and I'm kind of a car guy, and I have this great fear that as soon as the first big insurance study comes out that shows that these things are actually safer than human drivers, they will be mandated and we won't be allowed to drive anymore. We'll all be slaves to the robots. And when you tell it to take you to the bar, it's going to take you to the gym instead because that's where you need to go. And I have a dystopian view of the autonomous car. But if you are 91 years old and your eyesight's failing and you can't drive anymore, it's going to be an enormous boon to people.
Yeah.
It's particularly been an enormous boon to people who don't live in big urban areas where taxis and Uber and Lyft and things like that are relatively easy to access. It's amazing how quickly you get spoiled on this stuff. I was kind of way out in a rural area a while back and trying to order an Uber to take me somewhere, and your car will be here in 3 hours maybe. Good luck. And it's very different from being in Washington or New York or Los Angeles or Dallas or someplace like that. But there are a lot of people who live in smaller towns and rural areas and things like that who are going to really be seeing their lives improved in their old age in really radical ways. by these technologies, I think.
Yeah, and look, we live in a very high variance country. I suspect that um, you know, if people will want to drive without government oversight or somebody forcing you to go to the gym, there will be states that are simply going to allow that. Americans are very keen on their freedom, and very importantly, on their freedom to make mistakes. Even
Yes.
to take risks. Now, I don't know whether that's genetic. That people who end up in America are people who are willing to take risks, whether they live in Europe or Africa or Latin America.
Well, the cliche is that we're all the descendants of the people who left, and our European cousins are the descendants of the people who stay behind.
Yeah, that's right. And Americans are very keen on their freedoms, including freedom to make mistakes. And I suspect that there will be an insistence that people should still buy, uh, normal gas vehicles and being able to drive them anywhere they please. I don't, there may be some governments in certain states that are going to clamp down on that sort of thing, but we all know there are going to be states in America that are going to do the exact opposite just to give it to the libs, So,
Probably will be some of that. Yeah, maybe I'll have to move back to Texas
or Wyoming
these days if I want to keep my truck. But do you ever wish you'd done something else for a living other than what you do? Which, by the way, what do you do? You tell people I work at a think tank, I work for a nonprofit, I edit this website, but I don't think people know what that means, like all day.
I think that much like you, I read and write for a living most of the time. Obviously, I go on podcasts. Sometimes I go on TV. I go and give talks. But most of the time, it's really reading and writing and hopefully thinking. There is actually I have too little time to think. Don't you find? I mean, you can read and you can write and you know what your deadlines are, but actually thinking, stepping back and thinking, and that
I've managed to improve that some by getting rid of social media, which I don't use, and I don't have a television anymore, and a few things like that. So, and also by arranging my life in such a way that I have to do a lot of like 3 to 5 hour drives, and 3 to 5 hour drives are super useful to me. So I use the voice notes feature on my phone to dictate my thoughts on what I'm working on as I go. Right. My own little personal, Girl Friday there, and I drive places. That's super helpful.
Yeah, I still use long drives to listen to audiobooks. That's why I always rent a car when I go and visit my friends in Philadelphia, because it's 6 hours of just
Do you own a
catching
car?
up on.
Are you
No. I know how to drive. I just don't own a car. I mean, in DC, it's where the hell you park it, and it's expensive and that sort of thing. You don't need it. I mean, just rent a car. But why do I do what I do? I mean, look, increasingly, I'm thinking that. I have a comparative
the question
advantage.
wasn't why. The question was what was
yeah.
what do you do?
So that's what I do.
That?
I mean, I will write and I will edit other people's articles that will appear on Human Progress, and
if you weren't doing this, what would you like to do in life? What do you think you would do?
Well, when I had that choice 25 years ago or so, I simply decided that I cared too much about ideas not to interact with them. I mean, but also popularize those ideas. So when I was doing my PhD and I was thinking about becoming an academic, back then in Britain it was considered very improper for academics to do academic research, but then to also spread the word and engage in public debate. And I always knew that I cared too much about ideas not to then popularize them. And the comparative advantage of my idea is that I can actually compare my personal experiences from living under communism and maybe growing up in Africa and then living in the United States, and I can derive certain lessons which hopefully are applicable to the rest of the world. Basic stuff like freedom works both economically and politically rather than the opposite. And for whatever reason, in the United States, people pay much more attention to you when you have some sort of a personal connection to whatever it is that you are speaking about. So a lot of my American friends have the same views as I do, but understand the importance of political and economic freedom. But because I grew up under socialism, I don't know, my megaphone just feels bigger because I can say, look, people, I've lived through it. And maybe there is a little bit of psychological trauma of growing up under communism that I don't want to live through it again. I think it's not just my comparative advantage, but almost like a duty to remind people of what we have in the United States, that freedom works. and that instead of being, well, let me put it this way, uh, there are two different perspectives of looking at today's America. You can look at it from perspective of the past, and then the result of your analysis must be gratitude. I live today in 2024, not in 1950 or 1850 or whatever. Things are just marvelous. The alternative perspective is
February, you're going to have to start seeing 2025 already.
what did I say? 2024?
Yes, you did.
Oh, and the alternative is to look at America from perspective of some sort of a future utopian society where everything works.
Mm.
And if that's your vision of a society that you want to live in, then of course, as a result, the vision of America today must be one of resentment.
Mm.
You know, and I sort of think that gratitude is the appropriate response. Gratitude is not just appropriate in a sense of how much better off we are, but also I think it's an agentic feeling that we can do things in the future. Whereas if you are just resentful, that's a very negative emotion that I don't think leads to anything positive.
Yeah. Societies in which things work may be overrated in some ways. Here's what I mean by that. You take Singapore.
Mhm.
Singapore is a very successful society in a lot of ways. It's very capitalistic, very free market, very orderly. It's got a lot of qualities that I like. And when I talk to people who live there or who've spent a lot of time there, they say you would never want to live in Singapore because it's culturally very sort of stultifying. It's not a very interesting place. I've spent a lot of time in Switzerland, which is a place where
Sure.
things really do kind of work. It's like it's famous for being the place where stuff works. But I don't think that if I were a 22-year-old person wanting to start a tech company, that I would do it in Zurich or Geneva. I'd probably still come to the United States to do that for various kinds of reasons having to do with, well, size of the market for one thing, but also just that sort of, sense of possibility and that sort of social dynamism we have here. I have some criticisms lately about Elon Musk, I think, but I also deeply admire the fact that this guy just one day said, hey, let's start a car company, and then did it and did a pretty good job of it. And now I know Tesla was around before Musk formally got involved, but I mean, very, very early days of the company. And that's a very American thing to do, to say, I don't actually know anything about this, really, but I'm pretty smart and hardworking, and I know how to, make money move around and know how to find smart people and get in touch with them, and we can do this. And one of the great things about Americans is that, and I find this is very different from Western Europeans that I know, is that Americans, particularly American men, I think this is a very gendered thing, as our friends in the women's studies departments would tell us. Americans will apply for jobs they are not qualified for, and they will do things that they don't have the credentials to do. And I think that's an enormously helpful and worthwhile thing to have in a society, because we will take risks, we will fail, and we will learn from doing that. And that's really the fastest way to get to what works. There's the fail quickly, of course, and fail well. And Megan McArdle wrote a great book about the values of failing well. I think that's a lesson that Americans kind of instinctively know. That there's not a lot of stigma, I think, in the United States for, I started a business and it failed, then I started another one and it failed, and now I'm going to start a third one or a fourth one or the sixth one or whatever. In fact, you can be elected president with a whole bunch of bankruptcies on your background, and being bad at certain businesses that you were famous for being in. And as much as there's this sort of disorderly and chaotic aspect to American life that I find really difficult to process and difficult to sympathize with. I don't like certain aspects of it, that kind of confrontational, kind of boorish attitude that Americans have sometimes. But I do love the fact that Americans will do things we have no business doing and go places we have no business going, whether it's the moon or wherever. And I think that just makes for a much more interesting and fruitful and productive kind of society.
Well, once again, who knows how deep the historical and cultural scars are in Europe, in a sense that if you went bankrupt in Europe for millennia, you could be enslaved. That was the penalty for financial disaster.
Yes.
Or alternatively put into debtor's prison. Whereas in America, bankruptcy is relatively easy. The bottom line is that America offers this tremendous scope to both succeed and to fail. People very often say that American social indicators are out of whack with our wealth? Well, that depends very much on who you're looking at. Once you start disaggregating the data, you realize that America is a place where social indicators are excellent for some groups and bad for other groups. What does that tell you? That tells you that what it tells me is that the environment is broad enough to allow you to succeed or to fail, but it doesn't prevent you from succeeding if you devote yourself to it. For example, our life expectancy is much lower than it should be given our income. It is much higher in Europe. But once you disaggregate Asian Americans, it turns out that Asian Americans live as long as the longest living people in the world. Mm-hmm. Our education standards are horrific, given how much money we spend on education. But once again, once you disaggregate the data, it turns out that Asian Americans come at the top of the PISA rankings. But the country is dragged down by other people who don't take the advantage of the American system as much as the Asians do. So I think that we just have to accept that freedom means both an opportunity to succeed and to fail. And I don't think it's proper for the United States to measure itself in these social well-being indicators to places like Denmark, for example, or Norway, where it's a very homogeneous country and the Overton window of behavior is much narrower than what it is in the United States. Bottom line is, the same things which are bringing down the American social welfare indicators that make us an outlier are also the things that make our GDP higher and that allow us to be the world's leader in technological breakthroughs and many other ways in which this country is special. Yep. There are trade-offs everywhere.
And those are words of wisdom. Marian Tupy, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
That concludes our most recent episode of How the World Works. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Marian Tupy as much as I did. If you'd like to watch a video, that's available on YouTube. There will be a link in the show notes. And we will talk to you next month.